3 nights after his funeral, the bell tied to his coffin rang. But when they opened the grave, the body was gone, and someone was watching from the fog. Welcome to the detective files, where logic meets mystery, and no case stays closed for long. It began with a letter sealed in trembling ink. I received it one early November morning, just as Holmes was pouring the last of the Turkish blend into his pipe. The fog outside our Baker Street window was so dense, it rendered the gas lamps useless, like pale ghosts trying to pierce a grey ocean. I remember the flick of Holmes's match, the way the flame briefly lit his cheekbones, and the silence that followed my reading of the letter aloud. My name is Reverend Jonathan Fell. 3 days ago, I buried a man whose funeral bell rang last night, long after he was in the ground. I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to come at once to the village of Bellmere. Something is terribly wrong with the dead. Holmes, of course, said nothing for a moment. He tapped ash gently onto the saucer he always used instead of an ashtray. Then he said, "Fell, an old Devon surname. Bellmere, likely no more than a smattering of cottages and a church with an ancient burial ground, and?" I asked, trying to suppress the chill that had crept up my spine. Holmes turned to the window and gestured toward the fog. "And this is perfect weather for grave bells to ring." I stared. "You don't believe?" "I believe," he interrupted, "that someone wishes to scare Reverend Fell, or perhaps convince the village something impossible has occurred. Both are tools of deception, Watson, and I'm always intrigued when death tries to speak twice." We left within the hour. Bellmere was precisely what Holmes had predicted. Nothing more than a crooked cluster of stone cottages, a weather-worn chapel, and an overgrown graveyard at the village edge. Fog clung to every corner. No birds sang. Only the occasional groan of wind through bare trees gave any sign that time still moved. Reverend Fell met us outside the church, hands trembling as he clasped Holmes's like a penitent before a confessor. "You came," he whispered. "Thank the Lord you came." Holmes nodded once, the grave that rang. "Take us to it." We followed him along a gravel path, past moss-covered tombstones, until he pointed with a shaking hand. "There," he said, "the bell rope is still attached." I heard it ring thrice. At midnight. It was his family's request. He feared being buried alive. They insisted on it. But he was quite dead. I saw him. Holmes knelt beside the grave. I couldn't help but notice the disturbed earth, the slight sag in the soil, as if it had been unsettled or opened. "You buried him with a rope leading to this bell?" Holmes asked. Fell nodded, tied to his wrist. As per his will. Holmes looked up, his eyes narrowed. And if he was truly dead, who then rang the bell? No one spoke. Behind us, the church bell, ancient and rusted, gave a sudden low creak, moved only by the wind. Reverend Fell led us back to the church, where the heavy oaken doors groaned against the wind. Inside, time had paused. Dust clung to every corner of the pews, and the stained-glass saints wore expressions too solemn for peace. As we entered, Holmes's gaze flicked toward the altar, then to a narrow door behind it. "Living quarters?" he asked. Fell nodded. "My study and residence. You're welcome to examine anything. I've made no changes since the burial." We stepped inside the modest rooms. Shelves filled with theological texts, a writing desk stacked with funeral records, and a chair where Fell had likely spent many a sleepless night. Holmes's fingers moved over the desk like a pianist preparing for a performance. "Watson," he murmured. "Note how the pen was left uncapped." Ink dried at the nib. Something interrupted him, mid-writing. I leaned closer. The page was half filled with a dated log of burials. The last entry read, "Edgar Mortlake. Died October 28th. Buried October." The pen stroke ended abruptly, like a voice cut short mid-sentence. "Who was Edgar Mortlake?" I asked. Fell sighed. "A merchant. Lived in the manor house atop Hollow Ridge. His family has been in Bellmere for centuries. He was the last of the Mortlake line." Quote. Holmes glanced toward the high dust-coated windows. "No such thing as the last of a line," he said flatly. "There is always one more. Or someone pretending to be." Later that afternoon we climbed the winding hill path to the Mortlake estate. The house sat like a decaying monarch above the village, ivy strangling its brickwork, windows shuttered, its chimneys coughing out no smoke. A maid answered the door. She was thin, with haunted eyes and a black ribbon tied at the throat. "You've come about the bell," she said without prompting. We exchanged glances. Yes, I said, is the widow receiving? She nodded once, stepping aside. She waits in the morning room. She doesn't speak much anymore. The room was cold. Fireplace unlit. Curtains drawn. Amidst the gloom, seated like a ghost in the center, was Mrs. Lillian Mortlake, a woman in her late 30s, dressed entirely in crepe black. A veil shadowed her face. Holmes offered a short bow. I am Sherlock Holmes. This is Dr. Watson. Your letter brought us here. She lifted her chin, but did not remove the veil. Her voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. I did not write you, Holmes stilled, but the Reverend. He acted on his own, she said. I had no wish to stir the matter. It is painful enough. I stepped forward gently. We heard the bell rang. A pause. Then, faintly, her voice quivered. It rang 3 times. I heard it from this very room, and when I opened the curtains to look down on the graveyard, I saw something standing at Edgar's grave. Holmes's face did not change. Something, he asked. Her breath shuddered. A man. Holmes did not move, his grey eyes fixed upon the veiled widow like a pendulum freezing mid-swing. The room's silence grew unbearable, until Holmes finally spoke. You saw him clearly? No, she murmured, fingers clasping the edge of her gown. He stood where the fog thickened. I only glimpsed the outline, tall, still, facing the church. Did he move? Not at first. I watched for what felt like minutes. Then, slowly, he raised his hand. To wave. She hesitated. No, he pointed. Upward. At this very house, even through the veil, I could see the tremor in her lips. Holmes crossed his arms. And you believe it was your husband? She nodded once, but Edgar was buried. A silence followed. Holmes glanced at the thick velvet drapes, the fireplace, the rug beneath our feet. Then his voice dropped. Is there anyone else living here? She shook her head. Only myself, the maid, and our groundsman, Mr. Pritchard. He sleeps in the cellar. Keeps to himself. Holmes looked intrigued. A groundsman in the cellar, while the dead rise above him. An interesting metaphor, don't you think, Watson? I didn't reply. Something in the air had changed. A pressure behind my ears. As if the house didn't like being questioned. We left shortly after, promising to return in the evening. Outside, the sun hung low behind the clouds, casting no warmth. Holmes lit a cigarette, letting the smoke trail into the damp air. Well, I asked. She's lying, he said bluntly. I frowned about the man. No, he said, about writing the letter. She did write it. But she regrets it now. Someone, or something, convinced her to change her story. You think she's in danger? I think, Holmes said slowly, that she may not be the only Mortlake left alive. We were halfway down the hillside path when a sudden crack echoed behind us. We turned sharply, just in time to see a dark figure vanish behind the trees lining the estate garden wall. Without a word, Holmes bolted forward. I followed. We weaved through hedges and thorns, boots skidding on damp stones, until we reached the wrought iron gate behind the manor. It was swinging slightly, as if someone had passed through moments ago. Holmes knelt and examined the mud. No prints, he muttered. But someone was here. He stood, scanning the tree line. Then he pointed. Watson. Look there. In the mist, half covered by roots and ivy, stood a statue of an angel. Its stone hands cupped something metal, something round. A bell. The statue of the angel was unlike any I had seen before. Its face had no eyes, just smooth stone where sight should be. Its wings, chipped and blackened by age, loomed like curtains of ash behind it. But what drew Holmes's attention, and mine, was the bell it held. A small brass object, similar to the grave bell, but older, rusted, with a crimson ribbon tied at its base. Holmes stared for a long time. Then, he turned to me. This was no garden ornament, he said. This statue once stood inside a mausoleum or a tomb. You're sure? There's lichen here, he pointed to the pedestal, but not here. His finger moved to the bell. This was moved recently. See the scrape marks? Someone placed it here deliberately. I took a slow breath. Holmes, do you think someone is reusing the bell? He didn't answer. Instead, he turned and strode down the slope toward the graveyard. We reached Edgar Mortlake's grave, just as the sky darkened. The Reverend stood nearby, hands clasped behind his back, as if in quiet vigil. Holmes gestured sharply. "Reverend, I must see the coffin." Fell looked stunned. Mr. Holmes, surely you don't mean to—" "I do, but he was buried." "Then we have nothing to fear." Quote. Reverend Fell wavered, then gave a reluctant nod. It took 3 men and the help of the gravedigger to carefully exhume the coffin. I will never forget the creak of wood and the scent of damp soil as the casket was lifted into the grey evening air. Holmes removed his gloves. With a nod, the gravedigger pried the lid open. Inside was nothing. The coffin was empty. No body, no shroud. Just a single copper ring, placed in the center, gleaming unnaturally against the dark velvet lining. Everyone stared. Even Holmes blinked. Watson stepped back. "What does this mean?" I asked. Fell to his knees. "This is impossible. I was there. I saw him lowered." Holmes lifted the ring with the tip of his cane. "It means," he said coldly, "that either the man was never dead." He turned to look up at the manor in the distance, or someone came back to fetch him. The copper ring Holmes lifted from the coffin shimmered faintly, even under the low grey light. It was simple. No engraving, no jewels, just an unadorned band of warm metal, worn and dulled with time. But Holmes stared at it like a sacred relic. "Do you see it, Watson?" I frowned. "It's just a ring." Holmes shook his head. "It's a symbol, one we've seen before." "Do you recall the case of the Larkhill widow?" I blinked. "The cult that used rings to brand allegiance." "Precisely." He handed me the copper circle carefully, like it might bite. "Feel the weight." I held it in my palm. It was heavier than it should have been. Holmes turned back to the coffin. "This is no grave ornament, it's a message. Whoever removed the body wanted us to find this." Reverend Fell stood behind us, visibly shaken. "Mr. Holmes, are you saying Edgar was never in that coffin?" Holmes exhaled. "No. I believe he was, but now he's not, which leaves us with 2 possibilities. Someone dug him out quietly, or someone helped him out from the inside." Fell crossed himself. I wanted to laugh, to dismiss the absurdity. But there was something about the cold inside that coffin. A wrongness, like the absence of death, where death should be. That evening, back at the vicarage, Holmes sat cross-legged in the Reverend's study, the ring on the desk before him. He'd been silent for nearly an hour, eyes closed, fingers steepled. Finally, he said without opening his eyes, "We must find the man who made the coffin." Fell looked up. "You think he'll know something?" "I think," Holmes murmured, "he may not exist at all." Fell blinked. "What do you mean?" Holmes opened his eyes. "I mean, there's no carpenter named Elijah Trowell in Bellmere, or anywhere nearby. I checked parish records, yet the coffin bears his stamp." I leaned forward. "So the stamp is forged?" "No," Holmes stood abruptly. "It's real, just old. Elijah Trowell died in 1841. This coffin," he tapped the wood sharply, "was built at least 50 years ago." A long silence followed. Then Reverend Fell whispered the question none of us wanted to voice. "Then who was buried in it?" The next morning was soaked in mist. Bellmere seemed suspended in time. Its streets deserted, its windows shut as if the villagers sensed something unnatural breathing beneath their feet. Even the church bell tower stood eerily quiet. Holmes paced the vicarage hallway, while I scribbled half-hearted notes in my pocket journal. He had barely slept. The ring hadn't left his side, resting now on a silver tray beside the teapot, out of place, like a bullet on a dinner table. Without warning, the maid burst through the door. "Mr. Holmes!" "Sir!" she gasped. "He's come back!" Holmes spun, who the girl's face had gone pale. "Mr. Mortlake." He's at the house. We were outside in seconds." The fog parted only reluctantly, clinging to our boots and sleeves as we climbed the hill toward Mortlake Manor. As we approached the tall gate, we saw him. A man stood near the door, speaking to the maid who had let us in before. He was tall, gaunt, dressed in an immaculate charcoal suit. A wide-brimmed hat shadowed most of his features, but I could make out the edge of his cheek, a pallid, paper-white hue like that of wax. Holmes stopped several paces back. Observe, Watson. Watch how she reacts. The maid bowed her head reverently. The man said something low, inaudible at this distance. Then she curtsied, as if nothing were out of the ordinary, as if the man who stood before her hadn't been buried 3 days ago. We waited until he entered the house. Then Holmes approached the door and knocked sharply. The maid answered with a look of mild confusion. "Can I help you?" Sir Holmes didn't waste time. "The man who just arrived." "Who is he?" She blinked. "Why, Mr. Mortlake, sir." "Of course." "Which Mr. Mortlake?" She hesitated. Then, with complete certainty, she said, "Edgar Mortlake, master of the house." I stepped forward, trying not to let the chill in my bones reach my voice. "But he died. He was buried." She shook her head, smiling nervously. "No, sir. There was a mistake. They found him at a cousin's estate. He'd had an accident, was unconscious. We buried the wrong man." Holmes stared at her for a long moment. Then softly he said, "No, you buried the right one. The man inside now is not who he claims to be." We stood in the manor's great hall as the fire in the hearth crackled, though it offered no warmth. Holmes had insisted on an audience with the returning Mr. Mortlake. The request had been granted, almost too quickly. The housemaid escorted us to a velvet-lined drawing-room, where portraits of generations long past peered down with dark eyes and stiff collars. When the man entered, I felt an involuntary shiver. He moved with calm grace, but something about him was wrong. Subtle, but there. His gait too smooth, his gaze too heavy. The way he smiled as though rehearsed. "Mr. Holmes," he greeted, "and Dr. Watson." I understand there's been some confusion. Holmes didn't speak at first. He simply studied the man with unsettling stillness, as though peeling back invisible layers with each passing second. "You are Edgar Mortlake?" Holmes finally asked. "I am," he replied smoothly. "Though I gather the Reverend and my dear Lillian may have feared otherwise." Holmes nodded slightly. "And the burial, the coffin, a tragic misidentification," he said without blinking. "I've been ill. Away. The man you buried must have been a vagrant mistaken for me. My cousin." Perhaps Holmes's voice remained flat. "You bear no injuries?" Quote. The man spread his hands, none worth noting. A fractured rib. "Healed." Now Holmes stepped forward. "Slowly, there's a portrait," he said over the fireplace. "Would you indulge us?" The man raised an eyebrow, then turned. The painting was recent, clearly Edgar in younger days. Same sharp nose, same graying eyes. But Holmes's attention was elsewhere. "Watson." The edge of the frame. I squinted. Something had been scraped away. A nameplate. Only the faint grooves of letters remained. Holmes turned to the man. "This painting," he said softly, "was labeled not as Edgar, but Edward A. Pause." The man's smile twitched. Holmes continued, "Your twin brother died in childhood, or so the records say." The man said nothing, but in that moment, I saw it, just behind the composure. The smallest crack. A twitch in the eye. A clench of the jaw. Holmes stepped closer. "You're not Edgar Mortlake." A whisper. "You're the one who lived in the shadows." Silence stretched across the room, thick as the wallpaper's dust. Then the man laughed. It was not a hearty sound, nor even convincing. It was hollow, like the cough of something that hadn't used laughter in years. "You're quite imaginative, Mr. Holmes," he said, his voice low. "A portrait. A missing nameplate. A childhood tale." Holmes's reply was razor sharp. "Not a tale. I've read the church registry. 2 sons born to Harold and Margaret Mortlake. Twins. Edgar and Edward. One recorded as dead within a month. But no death certificate ever filed. No grave. Just a notation, removed to countryside for health reasons, and after that, nothing." The man stiffened, just slightly. Holmes turned to Watson and me. "It's a pattern, you see. Edward, the forgotten child, raised in isolation, perhaps in an attic or a country house, always told he wasn't meant to be seen. No inheritance. No name. And then one day, the favored twin dies." The man said nothing. Holmes's voice dropped to a whisper. "And so, the other takes his place." Reverend Fell joined us at the manor shortly after, summoned by Holmes. He was trembling again, visibly shaken. Holmes wasted no time. "You buried a man, Reverend. But not the one you thought." Quote. He placed the copper ring on the drawing-room table. "This ring belonged to Edward, a symbol of identity. The one thing he could leave behind in the coffin, knowing we'd find it, looked from the ring to the man seated in the armchair. Then, who was the body? Holmes turned to the portrait once more. Edgar Mortlake. The real one. Likely poisoned, or strangled, or silenced, in a way that wouldn't leave marks. I swallowed hard. Holmes gestured toward the window. And where would a brother bury another? Somewhere familiar. Private. Close. He turned. Watson, Reverend. Where does the house's property line end? Blinked. Just beyond the garden hedge. There's an old orchard. No one's used it in years. Holmes nodded. I believe we'll find a second grave there. Within the hour, we stood beneath leafless apple trees. Holmes paced in careful circles. Then he stopped beside a twisted root. Here, the groundsman brought spades. We began to dig. Barely 2 feet down, the spade struck wood. Holmes knelt, brushing aside the earth with bare hands. A narrow wooden lid. Unmarked. Handmade. No cross. No name. We opened it. Inside was a body, dressed in the same charcoal suit we'd seen earlier that day. But the face was Edgar Mortlake's. Undeniably. We carried the body back under the fog-dimmed sky, not to shame, nor to spectacle, but to truth. Holmes insisted it be laid in the chapel, on the stone slab beneath the stained glass window. A symbol, he said, of what the village had buried unknowingly. A man silenced not by time, but by blood. Reverend Fell stood pale beside the altar. His lips moved in silent prayer. I too felt a heaviness in my chest, one I could not name. The widow, Lillian Mortlake, arrived not long after. She entered the chapel slowly. The moment her eyes fell upon the corpse, she froze. She said nothing, did not cry, but I saw her knuckles go white as she clutched her veil. Holmes stepped forward gently. You knew, he said, a whisper. You knew it wasn't your husband who came back. Still, she said nothing. Holmes continued. He returned wearing his clothes. He said the right things, but he never once called you the name Edgar used. Not once did he touch the locket he gave you. He didn't know the faint birthmark behind your ear. Lillian's lips parted. Only just. You watched him pretend. And you played along. Why her voice when it came was like paper tearing. Because Edgar deserved it. I stared at her, stunned. She stepped toward the slab, her voice trembling. You didn't know him. You didn't see what he became. He locked Edward away as a child, called him a stain, a shadow, a burden. He made our home a prison. Not just for Edward, for me. Holmes was silent. I never loved Edgar. I pitied him. But Edward, he was gentle, quiet, broken. And kind. Watson whispered, you helped him. She nodded. I helped him become the man who could be free. Outside, the church bell rang once, not for ceremony, not for mourning, but as if to close the chapter. Holmes turned from the window. There will be a trial, he said softly, a reckoning. But I suspect this village will forget. They always do. I looked at the widow. In her silence I saw no regret, only relief. The following morning Holmes asked to see the Mortlake cellar. People rarely bury secrets above ground, he said, and Edward spent years unseen. I suspect the walls have memories. The maid hesitated before unlocking the heavy wooden door beneath the back stairs. The cellar was musty and stone-lined, lined with old wine racks, crates and disused trunks. A single lantern lit the descent. We walked slowly. Holmes's cane tapped lightly on the stone as he moved. See the scratches, he said, gesturing to a low beam. Not fresh, perhaps decades old. Vertical notches, evenly spaced. A tally. He ran his hand across a support pillar. Someone marked the days here. Possibly years. Prisoners count time even when the world forgets them. I turned toward the far end of the cellar, where a narrow alcove jutted inward, half hidden by stacked crates. Holmes gestured to the crates. Move them. We did. Behind them a narrow wooden panel with small rusted hinges came into view. A hidden door. Holmes pried it open with his blade. Inside was a room the size of a cupboard, bare, except for a small cot, a cracked mirror, and dozens of paper scraps nailed to the wall. Drawings, words, names. Most repeated again and again. Edward Mortlake. I am real. The bell rings for me. I felt the hairs on my neck rise. Holmes stepped inside slowly. This is where he lived. Before he returned, before he traded one prison for another, he pulled a yellowed paper from the wall. It was a letter. Or fragments of one. Lillian, I hear your voice upstairs. Do you know I exist? Do you know I see you through the floorboards? I ring the bell each night, you do not come. But I hear your cry, and that is enough. Holmes lowered the page. He didn't escape, he was released. Not by force. By grief, I whispered. She let him out. Holmes nodded, and helped bury the man who kept him locked away. As we ascended the steps, the wind outside picked up, rattling the house with a long, hollow sigh. Not unlike a voice, finally breathing again. Word of the discovery spread slowly through Bellmere, whispered over hedges, murmured at the bakery, passed like folded notes between pews at evening mass. But the authorities were never called, no constable arrived, no judge set foot in the village. Holmes had predicted as much. Some crimes, he said, unravel not by law, but by legacy. We spent that final day at the vicarage, while Reverend Fell drafted a statement for the diocesan archive. Carefully worded, names omitted, facts obscured. A tragedy was recorded, but not the truth. Holmes did not object. In fact, he encouraged it. Justice, he muttered, has already occurred. The village buried one man in error, then buried the truth in mercy. Watson frowned. So Edward walks free. Holmes raised an eyebrow. Does he? The man I saw was not free. He wore his brother's shoes, but not his confidence. He smiled like someone mimicking happiness. He lives in a house full of ghosts, walls that heard his screams for years. That is not freedom. We watched the manor from the chapel window. A candle burned in the third-floor window, the same room that once echoed with Edward's breath, his hunger, his letters that never reached daylight, and now, his silence. At dusk, Lillian Mortlake came to us one final time. She handed Holmes a box. Old wood. Metal hinges his things, she said. Holmes opened it. Inside, the original nameplate for the portrait. A handkerchief embroidered EM and a small familiar object. A grave bell, its ribbon faded, but intact. He asked me to give it to you, she said. Holmes studied the bell, then placed it on the windowsill. It rang to be heard, he said, softly, and now, it rests. She turned to leave. I called after her, Mrs. Mortlake, why not run? Why stay? She paused in the doorway because this is the house where everything began. She looked at Holmes, and you are the man who ends things. Then she was gone. That night, Holmes sat awake in the chapel. He did not speak. But I saw him watching the bell on the windowsill, waiting to see if it would ring. It didn't. We departed Bellmere the next morning, as the sun attempted weakly to pierce through the dense veil of mist. The village didn't see us off. No farewell, no thanks. Just shuttered windows and the sound of cold wind threading through bare branches. Holmes was unusually quiet on the train ride back to London. He stared out at the blurring fields, the grey horizon, the occasional crow perched on fence posts like judges overseeing a vanished trial. I finally asked, do you believe Edward will try to live as Edgar forever? Holmes didn't look at me. He already has, he said. I nodded slowly, and the widow. She chose her ghost, he said. We all do. In the end, he reached into his coat and removed the copper ring, the same one found in the empty coffin. It caught the train light oddly, glinting like a truth that refused to stay buried. Then he held it out to me. Keep it, Watson. A reminder of what? That sometimes, the dead who rise, were never dead at all. We returned to Baker Street in silence. That evening, as I began updating my notes and Holmes lit his usual Turkish blend, a sharp knock echoed on the door. Mrs. Hudson answered. She returned with an envelope, no sender's name, just one word, scrawled in black ink. Listen. Inside the envelope was a folded piece of paper, and wrapped within that paper, a red ribbon. The same kind once tied to the bell. Holmes took it between his fingers. Someone's watching, I said. Holmes gave the faintest smile. Yes. But more importantly, someone wants us to remember he tucked the ribbon into his violin case without another word. That night I awoke from uneasy sleep to the sound of a faint metallic ringing. Far away, soft as breath, impossible to locate. Perhaps a dream, perhaps not. But I know this. No bell in the flat was ever found, and we never spoke of the Mortlake affair again. If you enjoyed this mystery, don't forget to subscribe. More chilling cases, more brilliant deductions, only on The Detective Files.